So thank you to everyone. Anya and I are interested in identity. We're coming at it from two different perspectives. So I'll speak on the legal side, Anya will speak on the language side. We're focusing on the issue of dual citizenship. Now, the law of citizenship in Australia and Italy now allows for dual citizenship, which means that many people in the Italian diaspora are dual nationals. What we are interested in is the way in which identity and legal status are coextensive or not. And what we conclude is that identity as Italian is complex because of the way in which the law ascribes identity as compared to how individuals feel and use language to describe themselves. So as I've said, I'll present on the legal dimensions to show that while the law allows for dual nationality, and there are many dual Italian-Australian nationals in Australia, the law of Italy is over-inclusive, so some of those dual nationals have no substantive connection to identity as Italian, and do not think of themselves as Italian. And then Anna will follow up with the linguistic side regarding how people use that language of citizenship. So first to the citizenship law of Australia. Now, the legal status of Australian citizenship did not exist until 1948. That explains why we were considered British subjects, and the Constitution at the top, and I'll follow it around, the Constitution merely refers to us as subjects. The only mention of citizenship per se is to foreign citizenship in section 44.1. Now that section, some of you may have heard about in the media over the last few months, says that a person who has a foreign citizenship cannot be a member of Australian Parliament. And we saw the consequence of that last year with the High Court finding that 5 members of Parliament were ineligible to be in Parliament, and we've had subsequent resignations, etc. If you're interested, we can follow up in questions about the dual Italian-Australian citizen, that canavan, which I'm not going to refer to specifically in this talk. So originally, Australian citizenship was conferred on persons who were British subjects and resident in Australia, and individuals could be naturalised as Australian. That's once we get around to 1948. Now that's true until 1980s, when birth in Australia was no longer sufficient to qualify a person as a citizen. From that time, in the 1980s, a person also had to have been resident here lawfully for at least 10 years, or born to an Australian citizen or resident. So this led to cases which confirmed that being a substantive member of the community was not enough. Citizenship was formally conferred by Parliament and law, and the Parliament could change the rules to restrict access to that citizenship. So then what does Australian law say about dual citizenship? Well, we see that even from 1948, we've always had a section from that point which said that an Australian citizen who took up a foreign citizenship automatically lost their Australian citizenship. And that stayed the law in various forms until 2002. Now, I should note the position of naturalised Australians who were born with a foreign citizenship, but who are required by Australian law or practice to renounce their foreign citizenship as part of their Australian naturalisation process. What's worthy of note is that a statement of renunciation did not necessarily lead to loss of foreign citizenship. It depended on foreign law, and therefore didn't necessarily have that effect for the purpose of section 44 of the Constitution, and that's what we saw play out last year in the court. Now, this is just one of the number of elements of the law in Australia which highlights the divergence between substantive identity and legal identity. That is, one could have intended renunciation of a foreign citizenship and believe that one has renounced that citizenship, and yet that doesn't have any legal effect, so your legal identity is unchanged. Okay, so then we skip to 2002, and this section 17 is repealed. So there's no longer any legislative restriction on dual citizenship in Australia. That is until, and I just mentioned this as a side note, in 2015, new citizenship deprivation laws were imported into the Australian system, and these are only applicable to dual citizens. And these are laws which say if a person's been convicted of certain terrorist offences and they are a dual citizen, they can have their Australian citizenship stripped from them. So it only applies to dual nationals. But overall, the picture is in Australia that one could always be a dual citizen if born that way. More recently, dual citizenship obtained in any order is not a problem for a person's Australian citizenship, except for making them vulnerable to these powers. But then back to the Constitution. As I've said, section 44.1 means that if a person is a foreign citizen, they are disqualified, unable to be a member of Parliament in Australia. So one can be an elector in Australia if one is a dual national, but one can't be a representative of the electors, even though, according to the stats, looking at the census and other documents, and other data, approximately half of all of the electors are most likely dual or multiple nationals. Okay, so that's Australia. Now Italy. Italy has reached about the same legislative position as Australia in terms of tolerance of dual nationality, and even more than that. Now, more so than in Australia, there's contestation historically and even to today regarding the identity of the Italian nation state. Many of you will be familiar with the slogan from 1861 when Italy was unified politically, "We have made Italy, now we must make Italians." Now, despite that, and intriguingly, the story of Italian citizenship is, and always has been, one of blood. A blood bond which assumes a common ethnicity amongst its population. So my starting point is the 1865 Civil Code, which established the principle of jus sanguinis. And that's the dominant, although it's not exclusive, basis for Italian citizenship then and to today. Then you follow the mass migration period from the 1880s to 1930s and beyond, to which the Italian legislature responds with legislation, particularly the nationality legislation of 1912. Now in that, the blood bond determines citizenship, and the remainder of the Act is worded in a way to allow dual nationality, but without directly addressing it. Now some have said that this may have been a deliberate ploy by Italy to not be seen to be working against the general disapproval of dual citizenship across the world at the time, but in order to nevertheless maintain those links with the very large Italian diaspora for various purposes. Okay, if you fast forward through to the 70s and 80s, you get the push for gender equality in law through the courts in Italy, which has a big impact on citizenship, both in Italy and abroad. Because Italian law to that point had been patrilineal. It had included marital denaturalization, so if an Italian woman marries a foreign man, she automatically loses her Italian citizenship because the foreign citizenship is presumed to transfer to her through marriage. And citizenship by descent was patrilineal only through the father. Then you get to these two decisions in 73 and 83, and the Italian Constitutional Court overturns this gender inequality. And we have at least the second of those cases applying retrospectively back to 1948, the date of the Italian Constitution, and potentially even further back. There are cases that extend the effect back to about 1912 and beyond. Now, the Italian Parliament responds by amending irrelevant legislation so we have a gender-neutral citizenship scheme in Italy. That obviously leads to an increase in dual citizenship because both parents retain citizenship regardless of foreign marriage, and then both can transfer their Italian citizenship through to their children and beyond. So we reach the current state of the law in 1992. This Act continues the early legislative scheme, which means there's an indefinite transferal of Italian citizenship through the bloodline, and the estimates of numbers here are really significant. In the order of 30 million people outside Italy with Italian descent who can most likely trace and prove that descent, because the absolute number is about 60 million, but the Ministry of Interior Affairs estimates about 30 million can prove their descent, and thus all of them be Italian citizens. And there are other interesting elements of the law which reinforce the ethnic or blood bond of the current legislative scheme, in that you have extension of Italian citizenship to what are termed co-ethnics. So due to the very well-known border changes, particularly post-Second World War, there are communities that have an affinity with Italy, but they are now resident in particularly Slovenia and Croatia, and under legislation they have the capacity to retrieve Italian citizenship. Now in 1992 we also see an express statement in Article 11 of the relevant law that a citizen who already has or has acquired or reacquired a foreign citizenship shall retain Italian citizenship. Clear legislative tolerance and acceptance of dual nationality. Then we know that the Italian Parliament went further. Not only can you be a dual national, but if you are an Italian national resident abroad, you get to vote in extraterritorial electorates. So in 2001, we have the creation of the extraterritorial electorates, and this is in very stark contrast to the situation in Australia, which allows Australian citizens resident abroad to vote in Australian elections, but only if they have the intention of returning to Australia within maximum 6 years, not if they've chosen to permanently reside overseas. And all the while, the Italian Constitution, just rests in the background, doesn't have a huge impact. Okay, so that's the brief potted history of Australia and Italy. Overall, what does it say about identity and legal status? Well, in both countries, membership as a citizen does not depend on being a substantive member of the community. In Italy, there are many persons who are in fact a member of the community in that country, but don't have Italian heritage because they're from immigrant families. They may speak only dialect in Italy. They may know no other country, but because they do not have that blood bond, they can't access, or legally it's very difficult for them to access citizenship. However, as I've said, Italy extends its legal citizenship to people with Italian blood, regardless of lack of connection to Italy or the Italian community. And that extends potentially indefinitely down the line. Now in Australia, similarly, persons born here are not necessarily Australian citizens. Persons who live most of their lives here, but who do not take the formal steps of acquiring Australian citizenship, are not necessarily Australian citizens. And we've had recent cases of people coming here at age 3, living here till their mid-60s and being deported because they're not a citizen, regardless of their substantive connection. So the fact that a person is a substantive member of a community is irrelevant from a legal perspective. Now we turn to how language mirrors this disjunction with relation to identity.
So, being a dual citizen doesn't just entail legal rights, or a lack of them. It comes also with a complexity made up of lived experiences, feelings, personal perceptions. What interests me is the self-awareness, as well as the emotions that dual Italian Australians, citizens, especially those living in Australia, presented when I confronted them with two very simple words: cittadino, citizen, usually over coffee or wine. In order to do this, I needed to have a clearer idea of what Italians living in Italy and not dual citizens had of the word cittadino, so that I could compare the differences or the common factors with my fellow dual citizens here in Australia. The results of the comparison turned out to be a lot more interesting than I anticipated. The people I interviewed were of diverse age groups and socioeconomic backgrounds, usually from the ones in Australia, usually from Sydney, I have to admit. But first I asked the Italian citizens residing in Italy to define the word as they perceived it. So the first meaning and the most popular given was of someone belonging to a certain town or city, which demonstrates in a way the word's original sense in the well and truly still alive in Italy. In fact, etymologically, the word città derives from the abstract concept of the word civitas, officially from the Indo-European root ci, which had the meaning of to lie, to sit, and then in future meanings, let's say, it had the meanings of settling and inhabiting. But in Roman times, the word originally meant both the right of the citizen and having Roman citizenship. Not with the value of an urban agglomeration, but with the objective existence of a community. But later on in classical times, it assumes the sense closer to our days of city and city-state, which then corresponds more to the Greek polis. This perception of the word reminds us also of the still so used question in Italian, di dove sei, opposed to da dove vieni. So if we analyze the way Italians tend to use di dove sei, what city do you belong to, you'll find that they usually don't ask a foreigner di dove sei, but da dove vieni.
Yeah.
So what city do you belong to, literally? As Elisa reiterated in one of her last points, legally in Italy, as in Australia, people who are members of the community but don't have Italian heritage are too often unable to become citizens. Despite this well-known fact, The second most popular answer I got from the Italians residing in Italy was someone belonging to a community and entitled to the rights and duties of that group. Many different versions, but it always had that sense of community. Interestingly, I found, none of the Italian residents ever said the word defines someone born in Italy or in a certain country. These responses obviously reflect the issue around the ius soli, which we spoke about, which has been discussed at length in the past few years in and out of Parliament, and it hasn't yet been resolved. The issue is quite delicate, and it has had in the last few years many Italian parties very lightly, if I can say so, and carefully trying to come to some kind of solution. But I think it's quite distant yet. Now, let's move on to my main point of the research. I wanted to see what the dual citizens in Australia thought about it. So the Italian Australians interviewed had on the whole a very different idea of the word cittadino. In this case, the word had exactly the same meaning as the English citizen. They just didn't feel any different. Explained by most as someone born in that country or of that nationality. Things got interesting though when the second group of interviewees was asked if listening to the two words, one in Italian, one in English, evoked different feelings. All the dual citizens I interviewed answered in a very, very similar way, which can be summed up as an appreciation of the word cittadino as of being in a favourable and lucky position, one of freedom to travel, freedom to belong to another country. It was always perceived very positively and usually contrasting to a sense of duty, especially the duty of voting triggered by the English version. So they saw that as a lot more boring. Many respondents also wanted to add their feeling of belonging to Italy, or better, many then went into saying it was to a definite area or town in Italy. So going back to that Italian sense. The other difference, which deserves a mention, I think, is the allusion to a sense of pride. So when they went further into the cittadino words, there was always this sense of pride. But, interestingly, this never submerged in the Italians, in Italy's response, never a sense of pride with it. Now, on one hand, analysing emotions and personal definitions of these words really appeared to be rather unified within the Italian-Australian group. On the other hand, answers became very diverse with the next one. The issue that split the group up was that of voting in the Italian elections. As many here know, I'm sure, of the approximately 131,000 Italian citizens residing in Australia, around 31,000 voted in the latest elections. And of these votes, almost 5,000 were cancelled, as the voters use the Australian preferential system when compiling the ballot paper. So there's no touch. They're not in touch with the system, obviously. So, when asked if they had voted and why, two very, very distinct groups appeared, which can easily be subdivided in then another two. The first declared they did not vote, either because politics in Italy, and I do quote here, is chaos, that's the word that most use, or because they did not feel entitled to. When I asked for further explanations, many of these people said that they did not feel it was fair to vote for the fate of a country they did not reside in and they did not pay taxes in. Amongst, though, the other group, those that did vote, again, two very discrete explanations were given to me. The first, was often worded like this, was to get rid of Berlusconi. And the second was to get rid of too many immigrants. So literally they were saying there are too many immigrants in Italy, they're ruining Italy, Italy's not Italy anymore. Now the latter response has always personally fascinated me, since my own Australian parent should be considered one of these immigrants, while some people who, those same people would never consider my Italian husband, who came here only a few years ago, someone worthy of getting rid of. So I always find that very interesting. When I asked them why they thought they should vote, many of these people said that they did because they felt that they had a commitment towards Italy. And others said, and this I found very interesting, it was unexpected, because they wanted to keep in touch with Italy, and they felt that if they voted, then they had to know more, and therefore were quite informed. Obviously, then there was another group who are the ones that came in only a few years ago. Okay, I have to go really fast. Now that I'm trying to go, just skip here. Alright, now that I've presented this part, I'm going to go into something that Elisa brought up with the citizenship acquired by descent. Because another interesting aspect that emerged was that many of the dual citizens, especially the younger generations, admitted having no connection to Italy, and that they were glad to have their Italian citizenship because it permitted them to travel more freely in Europe. Obviously, in these cases, citizenship does not mean interest in the country. This group is one who shared no connection with the Bel Paese, very little Italian language, and sadly often a strong shame towards the dialect spoken at home by their grandparents. No knowledge of Italian politics or contemporary social matters, but who claimed they did feel Italian. These were also those who personally struck me as being stuck with this self-inflicting Italian stereotype. According to them, Italian means eating pasta, being attached to the family, being Catholic, being loud and traditionalist. Now, SBS recently presented a piece of news, you can find it on SBS, on the Sydney Rooster player James Tedesco. The main point of the piece was not that Tedesco, thanks to his Italian citizenship acquired by descent, was going to play in the Italian national male rugby league team in Italy, but the fact that he truly felt Italian. It was marked that he regularly visits his Italian grandparents, who installed good family values in him, and he said that he used to be big on the pastas and schnitzels, when talking about his nonna overfeeding him. The news report with a music score that recorded the Godfather movies was almost trying to justify the reason why this young athlete was going to play in the Italian national team. Now, it is fascinating to note that of the 33 official players in the Italian national league team, 8 were born in Italy, and 20 were born in Australia and acquired later on their Italian citizenship by descent. Now, according to an article in The Guardian, the selection of so many Italo-Australian players has been met with a degree of cynicism by the Italian community in Australia. Interestingly, the criticism wasn't about having 80% of the players in a national team not born in Italy, but the fact that it was inconceivable that rugby league was played in Italy. The team truly exists, and they call themselves La Famiglia, again resonating a bit of mafia. I wondered if the Italian community in Australia would be more or less critical to find out that there is also an Italian female rugby league team, and there are no Australians in there. Naturally, we have throughout the years witnessed many numerous cases such as these of sport professionals who come and claim a second citizenship to get a second chance to reach international levels. Only a month ago or so, Nicholas Pennington, who has never lived in Australia, was raised in Italy but has an Australian passport through his father, revealed an ambition to play for the Socceroos. I think the fact that Italy is not in the games has something to do with that. In conclusion, the identity of Australian diaspora dual citizens is a very intricate one, in which citizenship, according to the law, may often not be in accordance with the lived and personal sense of awareness of it, since there may be incongruity, thank you, between the lived and the personal sense of awareness of the citizenship and the way the law sees it. Having an Italian citizenship, the right to vote in the federal elections does not always coincide with being an Italian cittadino. While in Italy many live as cittadini, members of the community, but are not recognised by the law as Italian citizens.